On the 14th of August 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 departed from Cyprus bound for Athens, but it would never complete that journey. Within millions, a seemingly simple mistake escalated into catastrophe, sending the Boeing 737 climbing ever higher into a silent nightmare. Before long, both pilots and passengers had slipped into unconsciousness, leaving Flight 522 to circle above Greece like a ghost plane for over an hour. When fighter jets scrambled to intercept, their pilots caught a chilling glimpse: an empty cockpit and dangling oxygen masks, signaling an unimaginable disaster unfolding silently at 34,000 feet. But how did this happen? And why did an airline's seemingly minor oversight escalate into one of aviation's earliest tragedies? The answers reveal a troubling web of crew incompetence, flawed procedures, and a dangerous corporate culture that left 121 lives hanging by a thread. This is the story of Helios Airways Flight 522 and the deadly mistakes that transformed a routine flight into a haunting reminder of aviation's hidden vulnerabilities. Alright, first of all, some background. Helios Airways was a low-cost Cypriot airline founded in 1998 as the country's first private airline. Based in Larnaca, Helios operated a modest fleet of just 3 Boeing 737 jets, serving budget holiday travelers across cities in Greece, the UK, and various other European destinations. Despite experiencing a relatively rapid expansion, Helios faced significant safety concerns. Internal audits revealed serious organizational deficiencies, with one senior official describing a troubling culture of fear where staff were pressured to stretch the rules. This focus on profit drove leadership to push for extremely high aircraft utilization, leaving little time for proper maintenance. Flight schedules were so tight that crews' working hours were allegedly manipulated to stay within the legal limits. Some crew members even went without leave for as long as 2 whole years, which is obviously an exceptional strain on their well-being. And this was known about too. Regulatory audits from 2004, for example, warned of numerous unresolved safety management lapses, including incomplete training records and excessive crew duty hours. So severe were these issues that Helios was even warned that their operating certificate would be suspended if the issues persisted, i.e., they wouldn't be allowed to fly anymore. Now, there were also technical red flags that preceded the disaster. The specific 737 that was to crash, 5B DBY, had previously suffered pressurization issues. Just 8 months earlier, it experienced a rapid decompression due to a faulty door seal, forcing the crew to make an emergency descent and land at the nearest airport. It's worth noting, however, that Helios's maintenance team did repair the issue. This, however, did not mark the end of the pressurization problems. On August 13th, 2005, the night before Flight 522's fateful crash, the crew cabin once again reported issues with a door seal, this time specifically the one on the aft service door. Once again, Helios's management team got to work. However, and this is a very, very important detail, their work involved pressurizing the cabin on the ground. To do so, they had to set the pressurization mode selector to manual, and they did not set it back to automatic once they had finished their tests. And from that alone, you can probably see where this is going. Flight 522 left the tarmac at Larnaca at 9:07 a.m. local time with Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten, 59, a veteran contract pilot with 35 years of experience acting as pilot in command, and Pampos Charalambos, 51, who had been with Helios since the year 2000 and was serving as second in command. Also on board were 4 cabin crew members and 115 passengers, making for a total of 121 souls on board. It should have been an easy flight, too. The weather was fair, the takeoff roll was incident-free, and soon enough, they were in the air, bound for Athens for a quick stopover before resuming their journey to their final destination, Prague. Instead, the problems began mere minutes into the flight's initial climb. An alarm horn blared into the cockpit as the aircraft passed 16,000 feet. This was 5B DBY's way of alerting its crew that it was not pressurizing and that they were climbing into certain peril unless steps were taken. As for the techie explanation of what exactly was happening, the denser air inside 5B DBY compared to the thinner air outside at that altitude was behaving as all gases do when they're out of equilibrium. It was trying to balance itself. It attempted to do so by leaking out through the overflow valve, which, due to the bungled maintenance the day before, had been left wide open. So, what did the flight deck crew do when 5B DBY tried to alert them to this fact? Well, they did nothing. Nothing at all. The issue was one of confusion. On 737s of that vintage, the cabin altitude warning horn, the airplane's word for the sound now ringing out throughout the flight deck, used the exact same sound as the takeoff configuration warning system, which, exactly like how it sounds, warns pilots of incorrect flap settings and the like, and that was what both Merton and Charalambos assumed was blaring out, not the cabin altitude warning horn. As a result, believing that something was wrong with 5B DBY's configurational systems, they did not don their oxygen masks or level off while the air was still breathable. Instead, they continued to gain ever more altitude where the air would only get thinner. At 9:11 a.m., barely 4 minutes after takeoff, Merton radioed Helios's operations center in Cyprus to report the issues. By this point, it was already evident that his reasoning was beginning to falter due to oxygen deprivation. For example, he mentioned the takeoff configuration warning being on, which made sense. However, when he went on to add that there was a cooling equipment problem, it made less sense, as there was no reasonable issue facing 5B DBY at that moment that should have raised such concern. And the conversation between the cockpit and the ground grew increasingly confusing as 5B DBY climbed steadily toward its cruising altitude of 34,000 feet. Alan Irwin, a company engineer who had been patched in to assist the crew, asked Merton to clarify the problem. In response, the captain reported that, quote, the ventilation cooling fan lights were off. Irwin, a man who knew his way around a kite, immediately picked up on the peculiarity of the statement, realizing that it actually meant the cooling system was operating normally, since the fan lights are designed to come on only when a fault is detected, not during normal operation. Given that the usually precise and eloquent Merton was now making little to no sense, a clear indication that he might be suffering from oxygen deprivation, and considering that it was known that 5B DBY's pressurization systems had been tinkered with the day before, Irwin quickly began piecing together what was happening. He then asked Merton to confirm that the pressurization panel was indeed set to auto. However, this critical question, which could well have saved the flight, was either not heard or not understood. Merton simply repeated his own concern, saying, "Where are the cooling fan circuit breakers?" Irwin answered that question by stating that they were behind the captain's seat. He then continued to seek an answer regarding the state of 5B DBY's pressurization systems. But no response of any kind would be forthcoming, as communication from the cockpit totally ceased at 9:20 a.m. when the aircraft reached 28,900 feet. The pilots, struggling with the onset of oxygen deprivation, had simply not grasped that their aircraft was depressurizing. As a result, they failed to execute the necessary emergency procedure for loss of cabin pressure, which should have been immediate. Masks on, throttle idle, and a rapid descent to an altitude with breathable air. Instead, both pilots gradually succumbed to a lack of oxygen and lost control of the stick, while the aircraft, still following the pattern that Merton had entered into the autopilot earlier, leveled off at 34,000 feet, bound for Athens. For the next 1.5 hours, Flight 522 became a ghost flight in the skies over the Aegean. Athens Air Traffic Control repeatedly tried to hail the inbound flight, but there was no reply. Eventually, despite having plenty of fuel, the plane entered a holding pattern above Athens, following its autopilot instructions, and remained there, waiting for the inevitable moment when its tanks ran dry and it would come crashing into the ground. Inside the cabin, passenger oxygen masks automatically drop from the ceiling once the cabin altitude, that is, the effective altitude of the air inside, as if it were out in the wild, exceeded 14,000 feet, a threshold reached at a real altitude of 18,200 feet. Tragically, however, the masks, both then and now, only supply oxygen for give or take 15 minutes. Rather than drawing oxygen from a tank, they produce it through a chemical reaction. The idea being that this limited supply is enough to keep you breathing while the aircraft makes an emergency descent to an atmosphere with sufficient oxygen following a loss of cabin pressure. As a result, before long, both the passengers and the flight deck crew would have passed out. The Greek Air Force, concerned that the airliner ominously circling above Athens might have been hijacked and intended for use in a terrorist attack, scrambled 2 F-16 fighter jets to intercept it. Their objective was straightforward: get the hell up there and see if they could get a visual on what was happening. They were in position at 11:24 a.m., and the sight of this ghost airliner must have been a haunting one. With little else they could do, they held their positions and continued observing. Then at 11:49 a.m., they saw something remarkable: a man entering the cockpit and settling into the captain's seat. This man was Andreas Prodromo, a 25-year-old flight attendant. Thanks to having access to a proper canister of oxygen as a member of the cabin crew, he remained conscious. He waved to the F-16s on his flanks before setting about fiddling with the controls, no doubt attempting to bring the embattled airliner back under control. Unfortunately, fate had other ideas. At 11:50 a.m., barely a minute after it had been seated, the left engine flamed out and began to spool down. Not long after, the right engine did the same. 5B DBY was out of fuel. Prodromou did actually have a private pilot's license, but only for flying little planes, and he had been thrown way too far into the deep end. He would never have been able to begin figuring out a 737 cockpit, even at the best of times, and certainly not when it was out of fuel, slowing down and beginning to bleed altitude. As a slight mercy, however, there was one component very familiar to him: the yoke. Using it, he was able to bank 5B dBY away from central Athens and toward a rural area instead. Thanks to his gallant bravery and quick thinking, when the impact did come, specifically near the village of Grammatiko, not a single person on the ground was harmed, though, of course, all 121 souls on board were lost. In the immediate aftermath, Helios Airways' operations, rather understandably, came under intense scrutiny. To try and claw back some credibility, they voluntarily grounded their 2 remaining aircraft and submitted them for thorough inspections. Come August 2005, both had been signed off on and were back in the sky. However, all their efforts ultimately proved futile. The crash had inflicted immeasurable damage to their reputation, rendering their name virtually worthless. In essence, no matter what they said or did, nobody was booking tickets anymore. The following year, they rebranded as A-Jets in an attempt to shed the stigma left by the crash. Unfortunately, this move didn't help, and ultimately their finances collapsed. By November 2006, the entire company had ceased operations and its assets were seized by the Cypriot government. While the financial fallout played out relatively quickly, the legal consequences were anything but swift. In 2008, Greek prosecutors brought the first charges when they indicted 6 Helios employees, 3 Cypriots, 2 Britons, and a Bulgarian, for manslaughter. Similarly, in Cyprus, around the same time, authorities charged Helios as a company and 4 senior employees with 119 counts of manslaughter, 1 for each victim, excluding the flight deck crew. The Cypriot trial concluded in 2011, and it produced a highly controversial outcome: acquittals across the board. In their view, there simply wasn't a hard-proven link between Helios's incompetent negligence, which they had no doubt about, and the direct cause of the crash. This, if nothing else, is an interesting outcome, given that the Greek Ministry of Communications and Transport's investigation into the crash, the same investigation we've used as our key source in today's video, returned its findings and published a corresponding report as early as 2006. It isn't as if all those issues that we discussed back in Chapter 1 were unknown at the time. The Greeks, however, were not of the same mind. In 2012, they secured 10-year custodial sentences for 4 Helios officials: the CEO, the operations manager, the chief pilot, and, curiously, Alan Irwin. Yet even these sentences did not result in any jail time. 2 of the officials were given the option to buy out their sentences for around 79,000 euros each, an opportunity they naturally jumped on. The chief pilot, the Bulgarian we mentioned earlier, had his sentence thrown out following intervention by his home government. The final individual, Irwin, chose a different path. He stood his ground, maintained his innocence, and instead opted to use his legal right to an appeal in order to see things through to the bitter end and try and earn a full and proper clearing of his name. For his part, he did manage to achieve exactly that, with his appeal succeeding and his sentence being overturned in 2013. And if you're wondering what exactly it was that saw Irwin, of all people, dragged before the court, especially considering that from what we've seen, he almost comes off as the hero of the story, diagnosing the problem from the ground and coming within a whisker of averting it, well, do you remember when we mentioned that someone left the pressurization mode selector set to manual? Well, yeah. That was him. His professing of innocence was rooted in the fact that his mistake was an understandable one, a mistake anyone could have made, and that the onus fell on the flight crew. After all, it was the crew's responsibility to ensure that the aircraft was safe before taking off, not the maintenance engineer's role to pick up on such issues. This argument was further compounded by supplementary points, such as the fact that the flight crew had also misidentified the pertinent warning alarms in flight. As for the matter of whether or not the Greek judiciary was right to quash his sentence, well, you'll just have to make up your own mind on that. Beyond the courtroom, however, aviation authorities naturally implemented changes to prevent another Helios-type accident from ever happening again. This is where it all comes full circle. Aviation rules, like all health and safety regulations, are texts penned in blood. Lessons learned the hard way. Specifically, both Boeing and the FAA in the US issued bulletins and airworthiness directives to modify the 737's warning systems. One such directive, issued in 2006, called for added clarity in the flight manual regarding the correct setting of the pressurization system, along with improved procedures for identifying the cabin altitude warning horn. Later, it was further regulated that the horn must be completely unique and distinctly identifiable from all other warning systems. Training programs worldwide were updated as well, with airlines now emphasizing the importance importance of the pressurization pre-flight check. Often, explicit checklist reminders were added to verify the switch position after maintenance. In addition, reinforced training on hypoxia, that is, a lack of oxygen, became far more ingrained to hopefully enable flight crews to identify creeping symptoms long before the aircraft itself signals an alert. And while we're speaking of training, Flight 522 has also become a staple case study in crew resource management courses, perfectly demonstrating the critical roles of assertiveness and communication. For example, using it as a reference, first officers are taught the importance of speaking up if a captain is troubleshooting oddly, while captains are similarly reminded to check the basics of oxygen and cabin altitude first should any bizarre moments of confusion arise. The accident also spurred discussions about the role of cabin crew in emergencies. Although pilots remain the primary decision makers, Flight 522 and the actions of prodromo therein highlighted that flight attendants could serve as the last line of defense in times of crisis. As a result, training and standards were amended with that consideration in mind. While the lessons learned are interesting and, make no mistake, very useful, ultimately, a story such as this should conclude on one note and one note only: the victims. Among the 121 lives tragically lost aboard Helios Airways Flight 522 were everyday people like Chief Flight Attendant Louise Viteri, who stepped in to cover for an ill colleague and was eagerly preparing for a wedding scheduled just for 1 month later. The flight also carried 22 children, each with their own dreams and futures ahead of them. And we certainly can't forget the hero of Flight 522, Andreas Prodromo. He was the man who valiantly refused to give up, managed to get his way into the cockpit, God only knows through what feats given that it was a post-9/11 flight, and desperately tried to regain control of the doomed aircraft. Though fate was tragically against him, his brave actions in those final moments ensured that Flight 522 veered away from crowded areas, and Lord only knows how many lives his head, every bit as calm as it was quick, saved. Thank you for watching.